That's me. Yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely.
Just want to check that sort of back. We'll discuss it all.
Yeah, great.
Great. So welcome to the session on energy networks, storage, and vectors. We're going to start off with a session on energy networks, and we've got two great people, Bryce and Ted. Joining us. Just a senior moment there, mind blank. Fairly relaxed. We're going to run this where we'll have the two presentations back to back, and then we'll kind of get into a much more relaxed mode, and we can then ask lots of questions. My idea is to try and have a fairly lively and debate, and that if anybody in the audience wants to also answer some of the questions, don't just expect us as interactive here. So if you guys got different perspectives, please go on. But let me just hand over to Bryce, and I'm going to let Mel and Ted just give a few minutes of introducing themselves, then we can get going. Okay.
That's great. Thanks very much, Malcolm. So I'm Melanie Bryce. I'm the Oxfordshire Programme Director at Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, and also the lead on Project LEO, Local Energy Oxfordshire. And the project's been running now for 3 years. It's got one more year to go. We got an extension because of COVID, which was fantastic. And we are sponsored by Innovate UK as part of the Prospering from the Energy Revolution programme. And we also have funding from Ofgem through the Transition project. So it's a very large project, and it combines two funding streams, and it's the first time that's been done for innovation. We also have a very large consortium that represents the end-to-end of the energy system, which means that we can test the flexibility that we need to test for LEO. So we have the Low Carbon Hub, who have generation assets in the area. We have both the councils, who are instrumental in things like forward planning and mapping. We have both the universities who are looking at the data. And then we have what I call more the sort of market people. So we have Piccolo, EDF, and Nuve. So Nuve have V2G assets, and Piccolo have a platform that is looking at facilitating flexibility. And then we have Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, and they knit it all together with the wires and the cables. So Project LEO, what, how, and why? So we've got Project LEO together because we're trying to get to the net zero emissions targets by 2050. And one of the ways that we can do this is by using the networks in the most efficient way. So, do we reinforce the network to get to net zero? Can we use flexibility? And this project is all about using flexibility. And we need to test and trial this. So we're testing and trialing it with assets in Oxfordshire. So you can see there we've got Sanford Hydro, we've got demand side management represented by a library, and then we've got batteries as well. So we are testing and trialing using all these different assets, and we are then feeding out the learning into different sorts of consultations that are happening at a policy level. So we've already fed out and been a case study for ED2, so that's the distribution price control. And we've also fed into things like the significant code review for forward-looking charges. So we're very much getting the learning out of the project as we're going, responding to consultations at a national level. So this is a diagram of the overall system, just to put it into context. So we've got the DSO in the middle, and we're developing the IT systems to facilitate this market. So we're developing a neutral market facilitation platform, and also a whole system coordinator, which is ultimately going to integrate with the ESO so that we don't have any conflicts of interest in managing the network at the distribution level and then at the transmission level. We also have the aggregators and suppliers who are acting as intermediaries in some case for the DSO and route to market. So that's where Nuve come in. And then we have the local community who have assets that are either within their homes or within their businesses that we can potentially use for flexibility, and that's being coordinated by the Low Carbon Hub. So I like to talk about the project as a whole systems project and divide it into 3 different areas. So we've got the technology, the markets, and the people, with the people being the most important. People are intelligent, people are innovative, people are the ones who are going to drive net zero at the end of the day. So we've had great learning across the consortium because everyone comes from a different place when you've got so many people together, and learning to speak a common language is really important. So we're communicating this as a systems project, and we're working closely with the Zero Carbon Oxford partnership that's being led by the City Council. So the next thing that we need to think about is the markets. So there's already established markets at transmission level for balancing the system and managing congestion, but there isn't anything really at the distribution level. So we've had to start from scratch and develop things like baselining tools, look at putting in market stimuli packages, and even developing the services that people want for the distribution network. And then we have the technology. So we don't know so much about the very local from a networks point of view. We don't know so much about the low voltage system. So for us, that's behind the secondary substation. And so we've put 100 monitors in across Oxfordshire to be able to monitor what's happening at the low voltage level, specifically where these flexibility events are going to be taking place. So alongside that, we have technology to do with the actual assets themselves. So we have things like batteries, which may not have been designed originally to input energy back into the grid, so they need to be reconfigured. So we did that, most of those activities were pre-trial activities, and we have now gone into our main trials, which started in November, and we have 3 trial periods, and they're lasting up till February 2023. And we specifically trialed DSO procured services for the last few months, with the main assets being B2G, so representing that sort of aggregated load. So we've been able to look at things like behaviors, how people use their car, how they optimize potentially behind the meter, what level of availability they have. So it might only be a 50% availability for B2G compared to a large battery, which is much more available and is able to offer a more sort of reliable supply of flexibility. So we're looking at all these things, and as we go forwards, we want to add more assets into the mix so that we can get more learning across our 3 BSPs. So that's our bulk supply points. So we've got one at Cowley Local, one at Oxford, and one at Vista. But if you go on to the next slide, it's saying that we have several trial areas, and these colours are all the different BSPs that we have, and it shows where all the assets are and where all the LV monitors are. And one of the things we had to define when we were starting off with Leo was what's actually meant by local. And you might notice there that Oxfordshire, the county boundary has a bit of a triangle on the top of it, which isn't actually represented in this map, and that's because this is the reach of our network, Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. So local has very much been defined here by the reach of the network and how we can use flexibility behind that. So as the network company, one of the things that we need to improve on is our power system analysis, getting closer to real time if we want to use flexibility in earnest. So some of the tools that we've developed have integrated weather data into forecasting. So we've been able to get weather data that's updated every 6 hours and feed it into examples like this for wind and for solar, which gives us a lot better idea, how much energy is actually flowing at any point in time on the network, and also where the congestion and constraints are going to be, so that we can advertise the auctions more accurately. So that's the sort of needs analysis side. We then have the other side of the equation, which is the evidencing that a service has been delivered. And in order to do that, we need some sort of baseline to measure it against. So we've also developed a baselining tool looking at the last 10 days of data that are metered from an asset, and then seeing how we can deliver against that baseline. And then once that is evidenced, then we can actually settle financially. So this is very much a demonstrator project. So in order to demonstrate something's happened, we need to have 2 things. We need to have energy flowing through the network, and then we need to have evidence it's been delivered and that some financial exchange has taken place. So one of the things that we found quite hard in the project is enabling demand side response. So to start off with, we must have had a list of probably nearly 100 assets across Oxfordshire that we thought we'd be able to use for flexibility. And some of them are already in energy, they understand it. Others, things like buildings that we were thinking we'd be able to use. There's actually quite a lot of things that have to happen before a building can engage in flexibility markets. And these are all listed here. So some sort of technical assessment to find out how much flexibility there actually is. Building management systems might need to be reconfigured, for example, the software and hardware. And then, the building might be used at some times and not at others. So we need to be able to forecast that uncertainty. And, this is all costs money. So we need to make sure that when we are doing the pricing, that we factor this into the pricing that we are putting forwards. And then on top of that, at the moment, because we are doing this as a trial, not very much of it would be automated. So you'd need someone there to actually press the button and make sure that the flexibility was delivered. So moving on to the very local. So for us, the very local is behind the secondary substation, and Low Carbon Hub are very good at the very local. And the challenges that we have for the energy transition really are going to take place at the very local. The electric vehicles, the solar, batteries, heating, for example, that's all going to happen at the very local level. And that's where we know least about the network. So what we need to do is how can we enable all these technologies without having to reinforce the network with all the disruption that would cause. So we've got ways of thinking of testing and trialing this with things like sharing energy with your neighbors and sharing capacity so that we can make room for these LCTs that we're going to need. So the perfect place for this in Oxford is Osney. Most of you will know it is an island, and therefore it's supplied by one secondary substation. We already have a monitor there that's been collecting data for the last 1.5 years. And it also has a community-owned Osney Lock hydro as well. So there's quite a lot of interest on the island. So we already have quite a lot of households that have some sort of low carbon technology, and we are putting more in over the next few months so that we can test and trial over the summer. So because of LEO, we've got a very engaged city council, engaged distribution network, and we really need everybody working together across all the different vectors to make something like this work. So from the very local to the global, we were lucky enough to get a space at COP26 on the UK Pavilion, and we launched there our international community for local smart grids. So that's very much bringing local to the global stage and learning from other demonstrator projects across the world. And we have founding partners, Ausgrid, NL, and Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, and also Low Carbon Hub as a community partner. So we're very excited about this and looking forward to moving it forwards over the next few years. Okay, and then to summarize, so LEO and SSEN are supporting Oxfordshire with key ambitions. We've obviously got net zero by 2040. We want a high uptake of LCTs in a very local area. We've got mapping tools which are going to be useful going forwards. We've got great partnerships through things like Oxford Net Zero Carbon, and most importantly, we're building a knowledgeable and skilled community of people, such as everybody here, to really drive net zero forwards. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mel. We're going to not have the questions now. We're going to go straight on to Ted, and then we're going to have some time to have some interesting questions and debate. Ted, welcome.
Thank you.
It should magically appear.
Magic.
Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ted Mose. I'm a researcher at the Environmental Change Institute at the Energy Group. I'm a lawyer looking at law, policy, and regulation. And I worked on the Integrate project on integrating renewable energy technologies. I'm originally from Kenya, practiced as a lawyer, and therefore blending the practical and research is a thing that has had quite a few interesting outcomes in my life. And you'll see on some of the slides, the magic has happened. So I'll just very quickly get into it. So it's a bit of a mouthful, my presentation today. It's basically law, policy, and regulation for smart local energy systems. And it's a very good segue from where Melanie has just stopped looking at local to global. And I'll give you a short anecdote as I go along. But this is what we're going to cover very quickly. So what are smart local energy systems? I'll not spend too much time on it. I'll cover what law, policy, and regulation are, the differences between them, and what impact that has on smart local energy systems. It's a wonderful thing that Project LEO has already been introduce to you. So that was going to be one of my slides. I'll fly through that. We'll do a short exercise and I'll conclude. So what are smart local energy systems? Yesterday, I learned that there's a sort of causal link between acronyms and funding. And so if you get the urge to throw money at me, let me not stop you. I'll try put us a few acronyms as I present. So smart local energy systems, SLES, basically it's smart, using technology and innovative automated ICT to power energy systems. Local is exactly what that means. So as close to the people as you can to have generation there. Equitable is a thing that's not mentioned as often as it should be, but this is centered on people and ensuring that there is equitable and affordable access to everybody. And sustainable is about the environment. So I will stop at that slide because about 7 years ago, when I moved from Kenya to the UK, I attended a conference on Africa in one of the city law firms. And financiers, government officials were there. And I attempted to propose that a good model would be to focus in Africa on smart, small grids, mini microgrids. And oh my goodness, I was told, come off it, boy. The regulatory hurdles of going for a small grid are just as much as a marquee large project, and politically, it doesn't make sense. Fast forward a few years later, right now, basically mini and microgrids are the way because of just the distances and the cost, and the aggregated benefits of it are quite important. Now, back to the UK. Why would we need smart local energy systems? I think the Project Leo presentation has demonstrated that. But it's really important to see who the actors are. Because whenever people think of smart local energy systems, the first image that comes is a solar panel on one's roof. But in terms of the system itself, all these actors are necessary. When you think of community energy, academia, you think of the networks, you think of local authorities, aggregators, asset owners, and so on. So the actors are really important to make this a reality. But what's also quite important is the law. And the example of Leo, so I'll skip that slide. You've heard about that. So what's the difference between law, policy, and regulation? I'm back to mnemonics. And so L, P, and R. So law, think of legislation or legislators or parliament. So laws emanate from parliaments or from the constitution. If you extend that, courts can also be a source of law, and contracts can be a source of law and constitutions. But generally speaking, when we speak of law, think of legislators, think of parliaments. When we speak about policy, I've put politics, which some people may argue with, but think of policy makers, think of governments, think of the value system that underpins government planning. So PE planning, politics, think of that. Regulation are the rules. So the more granular, what the permitting, the licenses, and so on. And this just doesn't apply to at the local level. And this next slide demonstrates that. This will be the quickest legal lesson 101 from international to local. So moving from the right all the way to the left, when you think of internationally, what treaties or conventions has the state signed? Those then apply to the country. Sometimes when you think of climate, when you think of the Paris Agreement, when you think of global conferences, some not treaties can sort of have a binding effect, but just think of what the government commits to internationally. That's law. Nationally, think of the constitution, think of laws, and therefore think of parliament. In some places, and like South Africa or other places, or the US, what they call states, there's the provincial level where the province has quite a bit of power. And I think a place like Germany, something like the Energiewende, municipalities then have a huge role in the distribution of energy. So we come to the local, think of permitting, think of the bylaws, think of building standards, and so on. So we are moving from law, policy, and regulation at all those levels, and they have an impact on smart local energy systems. How? So we did a report on Leo, and these were we did a law, policy, and regulatory review. And the question was, how national and local law and policy shape smart local energy systems? And the answer is that they do shape local energy systems. And as you will see in the conclusion, and I'm almost there, I'm not sure how many minutes I have, I'll be warned. But one of the things that we did is we went back to that slide in the circle and asked the people actually involved, like, how do you interface with the law? And it became quite clear that normally in the planning or in the policy stage, law is an afterthought, or when people are starting a project. But it immediately becomes quite clear that the law prohibits or enables certain things. And this, especially for people who are focused on tech, technology develops much faster than bureaucratic processes in parliament and so on. And so there's a direct link between law and policy and regulation and how you can actualize smart local energy systems. But there's a bigger problem, and I think it was mentioned this morning, is that national and local planning are disjointed. And in this previous slide, international to local planning can be disjointed, but at the same time, the international impacts can have a very serious implications on what happens locally. For example, we were told today that if you look at the 6th carbon report, that the policy plans must match the legal obligations that have been set, whether you're talking about climate. And part of the problem with this is that because we're looking at, say, 2035, if you read that that report, you'll see that there's a focus on larger infrastructural projects, offshore wind, nuclear, and so on, to the detriment of smart local energy systems. And so even though smart local energy systems are popular, and this is a question that Sarah asked, because of the legally binding commitments made at international level, smart local energy systems are not prioritized. And it gets worse because national planning does not match municipal planning or local authority planning. And therefore, the impact of law, policy, and regulation can affect the uptake of technology and the rollout of smart local energy systems. There's a report shout out down there to the report. You can click on it and have a read. And I'm glad that Nick is in the room, Nick Banks and Sarah Darby. We worked on this report together. And so you can just look at all the different policy implications that were there. Now we'll go to the little exercise before I conclude. So when I joined Oxford about a year and a half ago, I had an elephant. And this, whenever I put this up, it feels a little vain to have my own picture standing next to a wild beast. But this was a wild animal. This was not a zoo. We were walking, no, we were driving. We were not walking, we were driving in the wild. And I saw a man standing next to this elephant. Not just next to this one, but a herd of elephants. Now, although I'm African, we don't do that there. We have a healthy respect of elephants. But the reason I was able to stand there is I've very conveniently cropped out the man who actually took care of this elephant when it was young. And therefore, apparently, they have impeccable memories. And incidentally, this Saturday, as the Integrate project was coming to an end, I bumped into a white elephant, the one on the right. And this was, I think, Extinction Rebellion, who were complaining about energy bills and the climate crisis. And so I just thought it's befitting to have a few elephants in the room. So the same way there's a contrast between that and that, I'm going to show you a few pictures between developed countries and the place for smart local energy systems, and developing countries and the place for smart local energy systems, and how centralized electricity systems or energy systems have an impact on decentralized energy systems. So if you recognize any of these pictures, raise your hand. The first picture is that one. How many people recognize this? Yes, so in light of what's happening in Ukraine, I think that's already been mentioned. There's going to be an impact on renewables. There's going to be an impact on energy mixes around the world. The next picture, I put this specifically because of Malcolm. How many people are familiar with South Africa? Oh, hands up, how many people? Yes, so 2. So I'll explain this. It's much funnier if you knew the context. So Eskom is the South African utility. And they have been experiencing blackouts, basically, what the rest of the world calls power cuts. They call it load shedding, so that it sounds nicer, like as they cast their burdens, just before someone's about to take the winning or losing penalty, the lights go off. And in South Africa, when people are flabbergasted, they say Aish. So Aishcom is like, what's going on here, Eskom? And this has a very serious implication. In my short stint in South Africa, in townships, they initially rejected solar power and went for centralized grid. And when they couldn't watch that winning penalty a little too often, and the people with smart or mini or micro grids could, there's a huge uptick now in places like Khayelitsha, I forget the name of the other huge Cape Town township, where there's a rollout of solar. So failure of centralized grids leads to smaller, smarter energy systems. There's that. And this really matches UK policy. How many people are familiar with this sort of site? Yes, so a lot more people in the room. This is supposedly the largest wind farm in the world, and the UK, if you look at the energy planning to 2030, 2040, there's a huge rollout of nuclear and offshore wind. So nothing, yes, renewable for the wind part, but nothing small and nothing local. And I'm not sure about how smart wind farm is, transmission costs and so on, but that's a debate we can have later. We'll move from Africa, Europe now. How many people recognize this one? A few people. So this is the Three Gorges Dam in China. And as you're well aware, the worst energy accident in history is not Fukushima. It was the Banqiao Dam accident, I think in 75, where at least 250,000 people died. And it was a hydropower plant. So even renewable energy can have devastating effects if poorly implemented, hence the case for smart local energy systems. But I'm not saying that large marquee projects don't have their place, but there is a place for smart local energy systems around the world. Finally, the A, B, and C's of the law, policy, and regulatory work that I've done is that there seems to be a mismatch between ambition and implementation. If you look at government ambition, and not just in the UK, to be fair, the plans, the promises, the policies never seem to match the rollout. And it's because the people making those plans, promises, and manifestos and do not have their feet on the ground. And that's why involvement of municipalities, people, communities, that circle that I showed you before, is quite important. And the resources to do it as well need to be channeled there. Secondly, there's a breakdown between international, national, provincial, and local policy. The main one here is there seems to be a breakdown between national and local policy, planning, and laws. And therefore, there's something called the Community Energy Bill that's, I think, gone through the first stage of Parliament. It's a step in the right direction, but it is the thinnest piece of legislation I've ever cast my eyes on. And so there's a disconnect. Finally, collaboration is key. Multidisciplinary work, which I've been involved with, has been absolutely eye-opening. There's usually a dearth of lawyers in the room, but the fact that I'm here, is great testament to the work that's being done here. So law, policy, and regulation is exceptionally broad, and there's a place and space for broad thinking, and there's a place and space for granular thinking. And that's why smart local energy systems would probably give a feedback that would also help in national and international planning of energy systems. Like how much power do you need to import, for example, would be dependent on how well grid balancing is done. And I think I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, I think will be asked later. Thank you very much.
When I come to us, they've given us this wonderful setup. Actually, you can see us over they've given us this kind of like dragon's pit down here. Right. Okay, so I'm going to open up. Are there any questions from either talk from Mel's one on LEO or Ted's one on law, policy, and regulation? When you're talking, just say who you are And to make it a bit more fun, let's just say one interesting thing that you've learned in the last 6 weeks or so, 6 weeks or 6 months. You can do it at the end of your question. And you don't have to do it because you're first. The others can kind of say something fun, just so that we get to know each other a bit better.
That's fair, thank you. So I'm Anka Mihalaki. I'm doing a DPhil on demand-side response with Nick Eyre and Sarah Darby. So my question is just a bit technical. It's about Project Leo. I'm not exactly sure what stage you're at right now, but presumably you've reached out to households already and started recruitment. Customers. Yeah. So I was just wondering what your success rate has been and what are the conditions for a household to join the program?
Yeah, so I'd say that we're doing, in order to demonstrate a market and to see, you know, what the impact is on the network, we needed to do it in quite a tight, small area, and that's why we've gone for OSNI. And so far, there's definitely a keenness to get involved, but it's you know, getting through all the things that need to happen in order for you know, flexibility to be enabled at the local level. So yeah, so it's definitely something that people are interested in. So it's a good uptake initially, and we've already got people who are, you know, of the right mindset and have maybe LCTs already, and therefore, you know, it's easier to make it something that other people in the locality might want to do. So yeah, so it's coming.
Right. Any other questions? Who's got the next question? Yeah, definitely. Name, interesting thing.
Mark Bristow, University. I'll have to come back to that. We're trying to develop a heat network with the university, and the university has got lots of buildings that they can link into that. If we extend that to not only the university, but city, Oxford, any other big user, it will probably make the whole thing 10%, maybe 15% more efficient, and it will be better for the local environment. However, delivery of projects within the university seems to take a long time. And my concern is, and the question here is really, should we be pressing to deliver a small scheme with the possibility of it being extended out to others, or should we be pressing to deliver a medium-sized scheme that's likely to take longer, but will be of greater benefit?
Yeah.
I would go for like small and scale up. That's usually how we would look at doing things, because otherwise it becomes overly complex and you're less likely to actually deliver anything. So that's certainly the concept we used on here, is Malcolm's minimum viable system concept. So yeah, so it's quite useful to use that. I mean, that's what we've used with all the interactions, and then, you know, slowly getting it more complex and putting IT systems in rather than people kind of doing things automatically. So yeah, that's what.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to say, I mean, what's interesting is that you're developing a new system, and no matter how many long you set whiteboard, you never know those cases that are going to arise which you haven't thought about. There's always going to be something there. There's always going to be a gotcha. And to do something smaller on a small scale, I think you get that learning quicker, and therefore it's that. And also, once you got something successful, then people saying, "Well, why did you do that?" But if it's if it goes too big, and you struggle to deliver, then people say, "Why the hell did you do this?" You know, so I think getting something small, getting it successful, and then knowing that you can build up and kind of be prepared for it to build up. Yeah, Colin.
Colin Lawden. I can't think of anything interesting that I did in the last 6 months, because it was kind of the end of lockdown and all of that. So sorry about that. But I've got a question for Ted regarding
you can reveal publicly.
Regarding laws and regulations. So some countries, they have regulatory sandboxes as a means to test new constellations and new ways of doing things before they're enshrined into rules and regulations. other countries like to enshrine things, first of all, into rules and regulations, and then see how innovations happens as a consequence. What way do you think is preferable moving forward for the development of smart local energy systems?
Good and quite complex question. Depends on what pathway. Regulatory sandboxes have worked really well for fintech and for places where the majority did not have financial access, did not have a bank account, and therefore the regulatory sandbox, basically telecommunications companies were running banking businesses and technically are running banking businesses. So in that case, the reason the sandbox was set up is that tech not only overtook the regulations that existed, but there was an ecosystem that worked. So I'd see a sandbox working so much better in a developing country where the infrastructure is not there and people have to do something about their energy. So that would probably work. In a more developed context, the other bit comes down to the structure of shoe. The level of granularity in law should be at the regulatory state, and the feedback should be as close to the, I want to say market, but a market as possible. You know, I discovered yesterday words like efficiency can have triple meanings. For an engineer, it could be output. For an economist, it could be shortest path to money. But market here, basically, I mean the system. So the closer you are to the system and the consumers, then the better it is to have more interface there. So at international and national level, it should be a framework, like the foundation. And then the development of the regulations should have that circle of people giving a closer feedback in a developed market. That's what I think. But then if there's something absolutely revolutionary and disrupts the functioning of the system, a sandbox is a good way to do it. Because for those who are not familiar, what a sandbox does is the government learns as the implementation is being done, and then the regulations are developed from it. But I think, honestly, law should set the foundation, and then regulation should be more inclusive.
Yeah, Thomas. Yeah, so one interesting.
So who are you?
Oh yeah, sorry, I preempted. Yeah, I'm Thomas Morrison, lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. So one interesting thing I learned was from Cameron Hepburn yesterday. So he talked in the morning, but he was saying that the challenge he thinks is kind of once we've decarbonized the energy system, the other challenge he's working on is biodiversity, which he thinks is an even bigger challenge. So almost from him talking about, I was convinced maybe I should be doing biodiversity research in addition, but I'm not sure if my skills are correct in that way. One thing I've kind of noticed, or I think I'm starting to understand, seeing the interaction between large generation projects and system operators, and maybe to some extent sort of BEIs and policymakers, is that maybe for large generation projects, there seems to be quite a lot of kind of bilateral negotiation in how certainly contracts are sort of negotiated, but also to some extent, it seems like how kind of regulations or how kind of financing mechanisms and so on are put in place. And there seems to be quite a lot of that kind of discussion. So I was just wondering if that kind of aligns with what you've kind of found in the energy system, and whether maybe some of that kind of flexibility is kind of needed for on this local level. And maybe that's one of the challenges, is that there's more bilateral discussion and flexibility for these large projects, but it's hard to do that scalably on a kind of micro level.
Okay, do you want me to go for that one?
Yeah.
So I think there's probably something in the fact that the larger generators seem to have more steady sort of price signals coming to them that go out over the longer term. So things like CFDs, for example. That was the case at local when we had the FITs. That has now stopped. So we don't have those same price signals coming in for local energy. So that's something that probably need to do more work to get something like that back in to be able to give those investment signals, because although we have our markets for flexibility, they're not going to be of that kind of same level that's going to enable that level of investment. So yeah, so it would appear that then it's not really a level playing field. Two different sorts of assets.
Yeah, I go a little bit further to say on the regulatory side is we have seen some engagement with Ofgem on this piece, together with the PIFA group and the group. Yeah, but I think the perception that I get from talking to them is that they worried about, okay, how does this scale to different aspects, different areas, different localities, different, how many different ways can we organize local arrangements? There's lots of different ways if you do it in the UK. And so therefore they find it quite difficult to say, okay, how do we engage with something that's quite messy and to try and pick up what's actually important, what do they need to do and what don't they need to do. They find that quite hard to do. We're engaging with them and they're trying, but I think they, unsurprisingly, they're finding it quite hard, as do the rest of us. And I would, if I pick up with Colin's question, whether you go sandbox or not, and I think it comes to the same thing, what I would say, no, you don't do sandbox. You do sandbox plus you have a regulator on the group actually trying to explore things. They can see the day-to-day problems and actually work through what some of those issues are. So it's not, because most sandboxes is you go away and do it, and at the end you provide a report. But actually what you want them to do is to learn with you to see what the problems are and actually work with that. And I think that would be a better model. And then they need to do some archetypes on different areas to say what is the different archetypes in different areas, what does that mean? That's my point. And
yeah, to just pick up on that, I think one of the least ambitious ways of doing it is viewing things from the lens of risk, which is essentially what's been happening. So whether people commit finance, it's been how risky is the investment. Biodiversity is becoming big now, because before it was viewed only from a point of risk, and now the opportunities are being seen. And so when you're thinking of tech and regulation and finance, because finance is really important, the projects that take off are the ones that are funded, especially in developing countries. So it's not necessarily the ones that are fit for purpose. That almost sounds like grant applications. You work on what you get. But I think when policy planning and when law actually doesn't just view things from a perspective of risk, which takes a shift of mindset, because whenever people are looking at projects and law, it's usually about risk, and that's probably the least ambitious path. And so I think the reason I did not attend the talk by Cameron, but I think one of the reasons now is almost future-proofing the pathways that people are going to take, takes a shift from looking at how risky it is to what pathways can we take to achieve an intended objective. And I think that's why I think law policy, if they set this sort of framework and allow what Malcolm has just been talking about, innovation within that basis, we can actually achieve decarbonization faster than some of the indices.
Cora, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm Flora Charbonnier. I'm a PhD in the Energy and Power Group in Engineering. Fun fact I learned in the past 6 months is that surveys showed that 70% of the French people believe that nuclear energy emits greenhouse gas emissions. So that shows that we've got quite a way to go to, if you want people to be involved in these new distributed energy systems, and if you want people to back the right policies and laws and regulations that will help us, we've got a way to go to inform people so that they have a better understanding of energy systems. My question was about the OSNI community, though it's got to do with regulations as well, so Ted might have things to say. I was wondering how much do you go from people just having flexibility and using that at the local level of their home to do self-consumption and reduce the bills, to actually cooperating and actually having coordinated flexibility decisions to try and help manage the grid together and reduce their emissions together and manage the constraints? And if they do cooperate, how much do laws and regulations and policy shape what you can and cannot do in terms of sharing personal data, protecting consumers from variation in their energy bills and so forth.
I think you probably just articulated everything we want to learn from our trials. But yeah, I mean, it's a step through process. You know, first of all, we need the people who want to take part. I think the bit that we are having to work quite hard on at the moment is that sort of collaborative, getting everybody together, getting a system, some sort of a process whereby, you know, that can be sort of aggregated together and then bid into the flexibility market. It's that whole route to market piece at the moment that is a little bit of a missing link, shall we say, in the whole chain. So first of all, we need to set up, get the assets in, identify what flexibility there is, you know, when people want to use it, etc., and then see how we can get that to be sort of cooperative across the piece and have someone who's able to get that route to market into the systems that are running the markets. So yeah, so there's a lot of work to do there. And in terms of the GDPR, that's always a tricky one when it comes to this sort of thing. So we have to be very careful that we're all analysing all the data and using it at you know, at the aggregated level that we're forecasting for constraints and that sort of thing. So yeah, so there's a lot to it, and hopefully, you know, if you come back in a year's time, we'll have all the answers.
I'll just pick up from the GDPR. One of the challenges that at least I observed while looking at this is how do we make the data usable to then feed back to change the system? And so it becomes a regulatory problem. If the GDPR is too restrictive and you have the data but you cannot use it, then it's not useful. So that's balancing between, apart from all the disjointed or siloed processes, competition law, privacy law, and energy law, sometimes work in silos, which is problematic. The other thing about smart local energy systems, which I've forgotten, so I'll keep it. If I remember, I will answer you. But as she was talking, there was something fundamentally important about how law will have an impact on decarbonization from the local level. Skip to
Thank you. I'm Gavin Killip. I work at the ECI Energy Group. A fun fact that I learned is that the way that we manage markets is really inefficient sometimes in terms of the spread of costs, and it's also very unfair sometimes in the way it spreads costs. So I wanted to come back with my question to your point, Ted, about the E element in the SLES, the equitable. If we're going to have future electricity systems that allow all of this flexibility of things, how do we create the infrastructure in the first place in a way that is fair in terms of who pays for what?
I think that it is a broad question, but
It's deliberately vague because I'm out of my comfort zone.
honestly, looking at energy, not just purely as a commodity, is a great start. Because if you look at it purely as a tradable commodity, then the forces of economics basically apply to it. And then at national policy level, there's very strong economic thinking. So if you want to put the equity back into smart local energy systems, it's looking at this as services. And one of the problems, which I think it's starting to come back to me, but when it fully comes back to me, it's looking at generation assets. Part of the legal problem of looking at assets is one, we have still a traditional view of ownership on them. And the second thing is the classification of, say, storage in law is obscure. And so it's looked at as generation, and that's hindered by the energy system. So back to equity, I think looking at people as provision of a service rather than just a commodity will ensure that the price also is fair and that the distribution, and this is where now economists and policymakers will come, distribution of that cost is made more equitable.
I come to add a little bit is to say what's kind of perverse in our system is that things like prepayment meters, which are meant to manage those who've got the lowest amount of resources, are often the most expensive tariffs. And that there seems something perverse in that. And one thing you can learn from, I think we should start to learn from places like Africa, is that in many of these places, many countries, we have a social tariff, which is not something that's really been talked about, where you have a certain amount of kilowatt hours per day, which is deemed to be what you need to survive on, and that's really low cost, and then anything beyond that, you then pay a high amount. So I think one of the really interesting questions is especially with the crisis we got on now, is that we need to be thinking a little bit more cleverly and to think about how do we target tariffs to the right people to make sure that it's not just equitable, but actually that it's appropriate to their circumstances.
Can I come back?
Yeah, of course you can. We're into lunch now. I'm just looking at the clock. I'll give you one more minute because I don't see other people are outside.
I think the tariff question is interesting, but I'm actually talking about what I think what Mel said, which is get the assets in place first.
Yeah.
And there's a question about who pays for those assets to be not just in place, but then also connected to the network and the reinforcement of the network, especially with lots of electrification of heating and transport and things that are being talked about. And the way that those things seem to be paid for is somebody always loses in the UK context. Somebody, the first adopter tends to pay a disproportionate price. Some of it is socialized through bills, but not all of it. So for me, this raises the question of whether the market is the appropriate mechanism for paying for the necessary infrastructure. And there's a bigger question about public versus private sector investment.
Yeah. So if I can just jump in before Mel, I think the interesting question is that the DNOs, most of their stuff is, and things like increasing the Y size and all that type of stuff, it's all regulated. So it's not really a market. And so I solved that. The flexibility is actually unregulated and therefore is a market at the moment. But I would not be surprised within 5 years' time it becomes regulated again.
Cost can become a barrier for new developments. If somebody wants to connect and there's not enough capacity on the network, the person who's got a new development or a new EV charging scheme has to pay a disproportionate amount, don't they?
No, they've just changed. The new regulations coming in. You talk about shallow and deep charging.
Yeah, so this is all to do with forward-looking charges and the new significant. And the connection boundaries are changing from being quite what we call deep, where you're talking about, the person who wants to connect is paying a large proportion of the real cost, being a lot shallower, so a lot more of those costs are picked up and socialized, through the duos charge, and that is to help get more system. But then that also has a downside, because that then means that those duos charges are being spread across absolutely everybody. Some people are not in a position to be one has to pay somewhere, and it's how that gets divvied out. It's still it is equitable, but I do think that the whole supplier, that's where a lot of the of the total bill sits. So people are able to take advantage of things like half hourly tariffs are going to do to everything else. So yeah, so there's two angles to look at. There's those who want to invest in the network, and there's those who are actually using it. But I do think that moving forwards, we are looking at more and more things like flexible connections. So where you don't just come individually and say, I want a connection here, or we've got this overview, and this is where we're working with the council to develop a local area energy plan and know when these things are coming on, so we can look at maybe a demand and a generation coming on together, and then you don't need as much reinforcement with more granularity on the actual usage of the network. So we're working on new ways of connecting. Just kind of, you have this much capacity all the time. You might have it at certain times of day.
One sentence. I think for law, there will always be winners and losers, but the biggest problem is that the most vulnerable people tend to have the least favorable returns when the design is made. And I think if law can then intervene to protect the most vulnerable or the marginalized, then the distribution of the cost, if they're winners and losers, they're not the ones who can not afford to lose. I think that should be the principle.
Great. Can I give our two speakers a, well, it's now time for lunch, and we've got about an hour and a half lunch, and lunch is outside. I see people mingling, so I would suggest you sprint outside to see, make sure that your favorite foods haven't disappeared. But thank you so much for attending this afternoon.
I am
Yeah, no, I just came down from Scotland. So.
yeah.
You What's interesting is theme. So you could say it's just one thing. If you take notes, what's interesting is that the theme under all the questions was how do you manage uncertainty? So it's things like your tariff things is uncertainty going forwards, the law and regulation and uncertainty of that. As you're changing, how do you manage that?